crean entre los cubanos y el exterior
Hola amigos, hola amigas, es un gusto estar con ustedes hoy que vamos a tener una invitada especial, pero vamos a hablar en inglés, pero déjenme hacerle algunas presentaciones cortas y vamos a hacer una transición al inglés rápido. La doctora Renata Keller, que es profesora en la Universidad de Nevada en Reno, ha presentado un excelente libro recientemente que se llama The Fate of the Americas, o en español sería El Destino de las Américas. El libro no está traducido aún al español, esperamos que en algún momento ocurra, pero la doctora Keller ha sido muy generosa en aceptar tener una conversación con nosotros y la vamos a tener en inglés. Es un placer estar con ustedes. Vamos a conversar, como siempre decimos, ideas. La frase de Bertrand Russell que precede nuestras conversaciones siempre está allí. Las mentes grandes discuten ideas, las mentes medianas discuten eventos, las mentes pequeñas discuten personas. Vamos a discutir de eventos, que somos mentes medianas, y vamos a discutir de ideas, que es lo que las mentes grandes hacen. Renata, Dr. Keller, I know that you understand Spanish. I already introduced you in Spanish. I don't know if I was speaking too fast,
No,
but
that's great.
the idea was to introduce you to our audience that many times watch our programs in Spanish. So basically, what I did was to introduce you, and now we are going to have the conversation in English. Welcome to American Conversations, or Conversaciones Americanas, the way we call it. Here we discuss issues of the Americas, of the North, of the South, of the Center, of the islands. And we know that you have been a scholar of the region for, although you are very young, you have been studying the issue for quite a long time. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Keller. She has been, I have followed her for quite a long time. She had written a fabulous book about Mexico and the Cold War, and now she's publishing this, The Fate of the Americas. Let me see if I can put it off there. It's a book that you can get in Amazon, and the subtitle is The Cuban Missile Crisis and the Hemispheric Cold War. Something that I would like to say in addition is that Dr. Keller is a prolific scholar. She published frequently in several journals, including international organization, where she published the first article that I read of her, that is called something like Letters to Cuba, and it's about the reception of the Cuban Revolution in Mexico and in the middle of the Cold War. And also she has published in Journal of Cold War Studies, Cold War History, and other major publications of international relations. Dr. Keller, welcome to our program. If I forget to say something about you that you would like to share with our audience, it will be welcome. I'm sure that I make mistakes when I'm presenting such great scholars, but let's begin the conversation.
Muy bien. Gracias por la invitación. And thank you for letting me speak in English. My ideas come across better in English, I think.
Okay. So, Renata, why is it okay if I call you Renata? No.
Yes, please do.
So, Renata, why did you decide to write this book after writing a book about probably the most interesting case in Latin America outside Cuba of a country? Because Mexico, although it was aligned in the Cold War, it has its own particular political system, a dominant party regime, a foreign policy that at times you need to understand how ensemble to with its domestic politics. It's very interesting how you went from Mexico to Latin America in the Cold War.
Yes, it grew a lot. So like you said, my first book was about Mexico and Cuba and the United States and that three-way relationship. And in that book, I talk a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis and Mexico's role in the crisis. And I began my first job at Boston University on the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was invited to join a panel about the event. And the person organizing the panel suggested, well, you could talk about Mexico or maybe the rest of Latin America as well. And I said, sure, great idea. And I assumed that there would be other books that I could look at about what happened in other parts of Latin America and how other Latin Americans participated in the crisis. And I was pretty shocked to learn that that just didn't exist, that even though there are thousands of books about the Cuban Missile Crisis, we just didn't really know what happened in other parts of the Americas during the crisis. And I decided, well, I want to know. And I started looking. I went first to the John F. Kennedy Library because I was in Boston and it was very convenient. And I discovered that there were actually really interesting reactions in a lot of places. And I decided, you know what, I think there is room here for a book. And I think we do need at least one more book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I decided that I would tell it from a Latin American perspective.
I have seen before your book a few things about the Latin America during the Cuban Missile Crisis, particularly about Brazil.
Yes,
That
Jim
there were
Hershey's article.
an article, particularly in Journal of Cold War Studies
Yes.
or Cold War History, that basically was even so long that it was published in two parts.
Yeah.
But it's a great article. I think it's by Hirschberg.
Yes, Jim Hershberg.
James Hirschberg.
Mhm.
But in addition to that, what I think that your book made good is that it's not only about the documents that are declassified from government perspective, but there are some references of things that are happening in the context of Latin American societies.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a few of those things that you found earlier and that told you, you know what, there is a book here, there is a road to take here, that there is a lot to say?
Yeah, I'm glad you noticed. I'm glad you noticed that because that was one of my goals for the book, was to look beyond government level actions. I definitely include what national leaders are doing and what international organizations are doing, but it was really important to me to look at how everyday people responded and how they participated in the crisis and were affected. And one of the first pieces of evidence of that I found was in the US National Archives. There was one particular ambassador, the US ambassador to Bolivia, and he wrote these amazing reports, and he also collected pamphlets and little pieces of paper that workers groups in Bolivia created during the crisis. And so I was able to take photographs of those. They were just these little tiny bright pink pieces of paper, but they had these amazing things to say about the crisis and how, yesterday it was Guatemala, today it's Cuba, tomorrow it'll be Bolivia. And so they're making these connections between what happened in one part of the Americas and saying, we're all connected and all of our fates are connected. And so that was really fascinating to me to see how what workers groups and what individuals in Bolivia were saying and how different it was from what their government was saying and doing. And so that was one of the first times when I was like, okay, I think, even sometimes you are limited to government archives, but they might have really amazing collections. And I've worked in intelligence archives a lot in my first book. And, those are governmental records, but intelligence agents also collect pamphlets and writings and things like that. And so when I went to Argentina, I looked in intelligence records there and I found, all these cool like flyers that people in Argentina were creating and some really creative ones. And not just leftist groups, but also conservative groups. And so that was one of kind of my main goals, was to show really the wide variety of responses.
So something that I noticed is that I got the book. I bought the book in its recorded version in Audible, but I asked for the book in the library because I heard that some of this material, graphic material, is part of the printed version of the book. Am I right? Because I have not been able to see it because the spring break came and the book didn't arrive before a spring break. I asked it through the library of my my university, but I heard that in the printed version there is sort of these graphic materials. I am right?
Yes, there are some really cool images in the book, those pamphlets that I just described, but also one really cool collection of sources, of visual sources I was able to get, were photographs from Prensa Latina, from Cuba's news agency. And they shared with me some photographs that photographers in Cuba had taken during the crisis. And, a lot of them were of Fidel, of course, but also there were a lot of just everyday Cubans who, women who volunteered to work in factories to keep the factories running. And these just really young teenage boys, in charge of these major weapons. And so I highly recommend those photos. They're beautiful. And I think they give us a new perspective on, again, how everyday people were participating in the crisis and shaping its outcome and kind of doing their part to defend their countries or to defend the Americas as a whole.
This idea of defending the Americas is an idea that you present from multiple perspectives. Because when you study this issue, you study governments that are on the right side of the spectrum and governments that are in the non-interventionist, or we can even call it a leftist side or left of the center side of the spectrum, at a critical moment in the Americas, because the Kennedy administration has already arrived, and ideas such as the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, is already in the making, and we have a big conversation about what is the best way to deal with communism, that specifically in the context of the Americas is the Cuban Revolution. So I would like that you talk to us about this first part of your book, that is about revolution and response to revolution that preceded the time of the Cuba Missile Crisis. If you are a Cuban, we call it La Crisis de Octubre, or the October Crisis.
Yes.
And if you are in the Soviet Union, I speak a little Russian, they call it the Caribbean Crisis.
Yeah.
So I would like that you talk about this first part of your book, in which you touch on the Cuban issue, but also in the connection of the whole continent. I particularly remember the detailed way you discussed the replacement of President Janio Quadros by Joao Goulart Jago after the discussions in Brazilian politics.
Yes, so I pretty early on decided I wanted to divide my book into three parts chronologically. So it's causes, crisis, consequences. But one of the hardest decisions was where to start. And I think historians always struggle with this, because we see connections, back and back and back. So actually, the first draft of my book, I started with the Monroe Doctrine and talking about kind of US ambitions in the hemisphere. But then that first draft, it took so long to get to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I had chapters and chapters and chapters. And then, I was thinking, well, the reader's going to say, I bought a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. When are we going to get to it? So I ended up cutting that and consolidating the first part of the book a lot. But what I tried to establish in that section of the book is that it was hemispheric reactions to the Cuban Revolution that caused and contributed to causing the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I look at how some people were extremely inspired by the Cuban Revolution, and they said, look, they liberated their country from a dictatorship. They're also liberating their country from US economic and political imperialism. And a lot of people said, we need to do the same in our own countries, that our own governments are unelected or, just run by the elites and by US investors. And so I look at how you see kind of guerrilla groups popping up all over Latin America acting on the Cuban model and Che Guevara's, guerrilla warfare ideas. And I talk about a few examples in particular in Argentina and Nicaragua. But I also look at places where, especially government leaders and people who, in upper levels of society, were saying, this is chaotic. Look what's going on in Cuba. And they're turning to the Soviets. They're turning to communism. We don't need this in Latin America at all, and especially in our countries. And so I look at how also the Cuban Revolution caused a lot of fear in Latin America. And I try to give, in this section, I think one of my other goals in the book is to make it make sense for people who aren't specialists. I wrote this both for specialists and for the general public. And so that's why I did think it was important to give background on, like, how did Joao Goulart come to power, and what does that say about these political tensions that were all over the hemisphere that the Cuban Revolution fed into and increased, and then those political tensions shaped how people responded to the Cuban Revolution and this sense of threat the Cuban leaders had, certainly after the Bay of Pigs, they were invaded once, but also after being isolated in the Americas and kicked out of the Organization of American States and things like that. So the main argument in there is that we need to understand how people responded to the Cuban Revolution and why, in order to understand why the Cuban Missile Crisis happened.
Thank you for such a nice presentation of the issue. I think that history matters a lot, and sometimes when people study the missile crisis from the perspective of only the United States and the Soviet Union, this part is missed. And I noticed that some people talk about the deployment of missiles in Cuba without mentioning the crisis of Bay of Pigs. And therefore, it's very difficult to understand this as an act of naked aggression against the United States. It's like the Cuban government was never acting defensively, was only actively acting offensively. You might have a good point to say the Cubans shouldn't have done that or should have not done that, but you cannot claim that it's a gratuitous act of aggression against the United States if you don't go and touch the topic of the Bay of Pigs. Since you mentioned the issue of the Monroe Doctrine, we in our program try to put history on today's terms. Now that we have the Trump-Roe Doctrine that talk about President Trump developing a corollarium to the Monroe Doctrine, do you feel that you were thinking that it was something too far in the history, but it's now present?
Yeah, I know. I wish I had kept that.
If I am deviating a little, but it's a topic that I'm sure our audience would like to hear your view about it.
Yeah, I really wish I had kept that part. I had no idea that we would be reviving the Monroe Doctrine when I wrote and published my book. I missed it by a few months. But yes, so the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, President James Monroe asserted that the United States rejected the possibility of further European imperialism in the Americas. And they said that any part of the Americas that had managed to free itself from European imperialism should remain free and independent, and that the United States would act to make sure that its neighbors in the Americas could remain independent as well. It's important to note in 1823, the United States had no way of actually enforcing this doctrine. It was really more ambition than anything else. We didn't have the naval power. We didn't have any sort of military power to enforce it, but it was a declaration, and it was an anti-imperialistic declaration. Fast forward almost 100 years, you get President Theodore Roosevelt in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he adds the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And this completely shifts it. So the Roosevelt Corollary is now asserting that the United States has police powers in the hemisphere. And it would enforce these police powers to make sure that its Latin American neighbors were responsible and that they were managing their finances and, responsibly borrowing from other countries. And that if they didn't behave responsibly, the United States had the right to intervene in in Latin American countries and kind of show them how to behave. And so it transformed from an anti-imperialist, anti-interventionist doctrine into a pro-interventionist doctrine under Roosevelt. And that's what the Roosevelt Corollary does. And it led to this era of gunboat diplomacy where the United States intervened mostly in the Caribbean basin, in Central America, in Cuba, in order to form governments that it could work with, in order to kind of shape the governments and economies of Latin American countries. And that is what Trump is reviving with the Monroe Doctrine, or the Trump Corollary. It is going back to this Rooseveltian idea that the United States has the right to intervene in other countries in order to choose the political system or choose the political leaders or the economic policies that its neighbors pursue. And it's ignoring the fact that the Roosevelt corollary actually created a lot of instability in Latin America and led to a lot of dictatorships and a lot of violence and hardship for the countries where the United States was intervening. And, we learned that lesson back in the early 20th century, and we had, then the good neighbor policy, which was a lot more effective in building healthy relationships among the countries in the Americas. But we have since forgotten that. And now we're going back, we're going back 100 years, more than 100 years.
And since you are a scholar of Mexican politics and Mexican foreign policy, it's very important to mention that the Mexican Revolution produced, along its development, a foreign policy that with the Estrada Doctrine revitalized or invoked the idea of non-intervention in areas such as a recognition of governments, and it proclaimed a constitution in which it declared non-intervention and self-determination in opposition, in some sense, to the level of intervention that the United States was producing or was producing in Mexico. And it's a very interesting thing that we need to pay attention, because let's remember that in its best years, the conference of Chapultepec, etc., the idea was to create an inter-American system of hemispheric governance, that it was unthinkable without the good neighbor policy. The positions of people like Adolf Berle, that was an American very involved in the American policy towards Latin America, etc. Well, can you talk to us a little, Renata, because I found this part interesting, the part of Mexico between the triumph of the Cuban Revolution and the moment of the Cuba Missile Crisis, because you described the contradiction in which the Lopez Mateo administration is immersed, and the questioning of former President Lázaro Cárdenas in the verge of the celebration of the beginning of the anniversary. I think it's the 50th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution. I'm talking a little longer, but it's basically because I read the book. I would like that you talk a little about this important element of Mexico, a big country and so relevant for Cuba then and today.
Sure. So I actually talk a lot about this in my first book, and I agree. I think it's a really important relationship. So Mexico had their revolution in 1910, and they, through the Constitution of 1917, established things like national ownership of resources, especially oil, but also a lot of mining and other things. They pursued a lot of agrarian reform, especially under Lázaro Cárdenas in the early late 30s, early 40s. And so Mexico had kind of beat the Cuban Revolution. It had influenced and inspired some of the things that the Cuban revolutionaries were trying to do in 1959, 1960, 61, similar things like expropriation, nationalization, agrarian reform. And for Mexican leaders, they had become much more conservative ever since Lázaro Cárdenas left office. And they had, many of Mexico's leaders had started to almost betray the legacy of the Mexican Revolution and to turn their back on it. And then when people saw what was happening in Cuba, people in Mexico were saying, hey, what about our revolutionary legacy? This government that we have claims to be a government of the revolution. That's what it called it. The governing party calls itself the party of the institutionalized revolution. What happened to our revolution? We're claiming this legacy that we're not really living up to anymore. And even including people like Lázaro Cárdenas, as a former president, he started speaking out in favor of the Cuban Revolution and in defense of it. And that put Mexico's leaders, Adolfo López Mateos, who was president at the time of the Cuban Revolution, it put him in kind of this awkward position where he was trying to on the one hand, celebrate Cuba's revolution and kind of piggyback on the enthusiasm within Mexico for the Cuban Revolution to say, look, we're still revolutionary and we're standing with other revolutionaries. But at the same time, he didn't want to endanger his relationship with the United States, this incredibly powerful and important country directly to the north of Mexico that, could make big problems for Mexico if Mexico went too far. And so that put, Mexican leaders, especially Lopez Mateos, in this awkward position. And at first he did speak out very vocally in defense of the Cuban Revolution and drawing these direct connections and saying, they're doing what we did 50 years ago. But then as the Cuban Revolution becomes more radical, as the Cubans start reaching out more to the Soviet Union and forming this relationship with the Soviet Union, especially once Fidel Castro declares that, the Cuban Revolution is a socialist revolution and that he's a Marxist, that changes things for Mexico. And Mexico never cuts ties with Cuba. They don't participate in the Bay of Pigs invasion, none of that. But Lopez Mateos stops drawing these connections and starts instead defending Cuba on the basis of non-intervention, like you mentioned. So he said, we have this longstanding policy where we don't opine on other countries' leaderships. We automatically recognize new leaders, however they come to power. We're not going to pass judgment on that. And so instead of kind of celebrating the Cuban Revolution, it's more of a defense of Cubans have the right to national sovereignty, and Mexico will not support intervention in any country, including Cuba.
I think, we are going to move to other parts of the book, but I just want to make a recommendation for the audience. If you read the book, Renata is very good at choosing some events that condense the conversation of great ideas at the time. And I want to mention that she discussed a conversation between Manuel Tello, that is the Minister of Foreign Relations of Mexico, with Thomas Mann, no relation with the author of the Magic Mountain. He was an American. I think he was graduated from the University of Colorado at Boulder. I don't remember, but I think one of the members of the cabinet was, and when I taught at the University of Colorado at Boulder, I love it to mention that because it's a wonderful campus and it's very difficult to leave it without some liberal meaning in your life. But I would say it's a very interesting the conversation that explains Mexico's position quite well. If you want to talk a little about that, Renata, if not, we are going to take the first break before we go to discuss the second part.
Sure, just briefly. So Mexicans were very good at communicating with the United States and explaining to them, we have this doctrine of non-intervention and explaining that we're still on your side, but the Cubans need to have their space to figure things out on their own. And Mexico, for our own domestic reasons, especially, we don't want to endanger Mexican stability by betraying our revolutionary legacy. That legacy is what's holding a lot of groups together under the umbrella of the PRI. And so it's not worth it to endanger Mexican stability. And American leaders had to agree with that. Ultimately, it's really important that there's not another revolution in Mexico. And at the time, it looked like that could be a real possibility, that they were worried that the Cuban Revolution could spread across the hemisphere. And Mexico is one of the countries in particular that they were especially worried about. And so Mexican leaders used that fear of a spreading revolution in order to gain U.S. approval of their unique policy toward Cuba.
Does that history rhyme today, or do you think that there is any lesson to extract when President Claudia Sheinbaum said that she's acting within a tradition of Mexican foreign policy?
Yes, I see a lot of similarities between Mexico's position today and the way that they responded and handled the Cuban crises in the 1960s. I think Sheinbaum has, framed her actions as part of, again, this revolutionary legacy that the current government is still playing off of. It's not the PRI anymore, but they're still, hearkening back to this revolutionary history. And I think she's trying to figure out how to balance these factors between trying to show solidarity with Cuba, which is, important on a humanitarian basis, but also important domestic, like politically with its own, within people and within groups in Mexico. I think Cuba is still important to some people, to quite a few people. And standing up to the United States is important to a lot of people. And so she's similar to what Adolfo López Mateos was doing, is trying to balance all of these factors. And López Mateos was able to do it more subtly and kind of behind the scenes. I think.
Well,
Trump,
President Kennedy was a different
exactly.
president.
Yes. And so I think the U.S. interlocutors have changed. Yeah, I think U.S. leaders are a lot less understanding these days of Mexico's position and less understanding of the fact that other countries have their own agendas and interests and priorities. And so the U.S. response has been different.
Yeah, something that before the break, I want to ask you on the issue of, I like that the book also touched countries that typically when you go to a library in a university, and believe me, I have been in 4 universities in the United States, either as a student or as a professor, in fact 5, and you go to the library in the section of Latin America, and you see a lot of books of Cuba, a lot of books of Mexico, but then you go to other countries and there is less, despite the fact that, for instance, compared with Cuba, there are countries that has more inhabitants, they are larger and things like that. And I like that you touch other countries, particularly in this section you talk about Bolivia. And it's very interesting the way you put the impact of the Cuban Revolution in Bolivia. Can you talk a little about that now?
So Bolivia is another country that also had a revolutionary legacy. Theirs was after Mexico's, but they also had a government that heralded back to its revolutionary legacy, led by a kind of hegemonic political party that, in the case of Bolivia, the MNR. And
Movimiento
so they
Nacionalista Revolucionario.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And so they were in a similar position of Mexico, where they were still trying to act like they were revolutionary, and Cuba provided an opportunity and kind of a challenge at the same time to prove that they were still revolutionary. And so they also kind of tried to play both sides in Bolivia. President Paz Estenssoro kind of occasionally reached out to the Soviet Union. He got a lot of loans and economic support under the Alliance for Progress that you mentioned. But he also maintained relations with Cuba and, allowed Cuban embassy officials kind of free reign to operate within Bolivia. And so it's almost a similar case to Mexico, but we just don't know as much about it because there are very relatively few books especially in the United States about Bolivia, or really outside of Bolivia, about Bolivian history. And
but it looks that there were very active right-wing groups there too.
Oh, yes, exactly. So there were definitely active right-wing groups. There were a lot of critics of President Paz Estenssoro. He was overthrown in a military coup, not directly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but a couple of years afterward. And so there were definitely conservative groups that were really upset with Bolivia's relationship with Cuba and with what was going on in Bolivia as well. And so the Cuban Revolution for right-wing Bolivian groups was like, well, this could happen. Like, they had already happened here, and we don't need another revolution. And they felt like the leftists were already in power and that they needed to prevent the Cuban influence, especially the communist elements of it, from spreading to Bolivia. And so it also ignited a lot of activity on the part of conservative groups in Bolivia.
So, well, let's have a break now, and we are going to come back now to discuss the crisis in itself. That is the second part of the book. That is also a very interesting part. I hope that you are enjoying the audience is also enjoying with as I enjoy reading this book if you enjoy by learning. So let's have a pause, and then we will, after the break, we come and we will discuss the crisis from a hemispheric, the Cuban Missile Crisis from a hemispheric perspective.